on the phone, it is a pleasure to welcome to the program Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, a professor emerita of ethnic studies at California State University, author of several books. Her latest is An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. Welcome to the program, Roxanne.
Thank you, Sam.
I want to start with let's start at the beginning. But before we get through, because I want to cover some of the aspects of the history that you document here that I think are surprising to some people. But in general, I mean, tell us what the reason and what is involved with, I guess, taking a different perspective on our history and why it's so necessary. And our history, I mean, in terms of the United States.
I don't consider this an alternative history, but rather the true history of the United States. It is from the indigenous people's perspective, but without that, almost any interpretation of U.S. history is deeply flawed and doesn't disturb the hardcore origin myth of the United States, that it was born as they admit now, a flawed democracy, a flawed system because there was slavery, and there were slave owners doing it, and because of the civil rights movement, it has certainly changed since I was in high school and studied history in the 1950s. It has changed, but it hasn't really disturbed the core origin myth of this birth of a beautiful republic that was just the beginning of the seed that was planted. And then we get into Howard Zinn's history of people's struggles that have made the country what it is. But then you have to ask, well, what is it? And you have to then say that, well, all of these things, which many historians do, say everything started with World War II and the secrecy and the CIA and the Cold War. That's when everything went off the tracks. And then you have to go back and you have to look at imperialism of Latin America and the Pacific. You have to leave out so much stuff. Then you go back, and what you find is that originally these 13 little British colonies that became independent and bound together in a federation had as their goal from the beginning, mapped out and documented in the Northwest Ordinance before the Constitution, the expansion to the Pacific, that this was the goal. This was being prevented by the British with their proclamation of 1754 that said the settlers had to stay on the coast and could not go over the mountain range, that was going to stay Indian country, and then, of course, Spain and France and other European powers were in the rest of the continent. And so this it isn't just the what you could call the original sin of genocide to establish those 13 colonies, but the continuation for 100 years of unrelenting wars against native nations to take the continent. So what I say is everything that is now, that is the United States government, and particularly its military history is usually left out, so we always see these wars as some bump in the road. And I think there's a big opening now for clarifying that, because it looks like we have endless war now, but we always have. We just hadn't really seen it as blatantly as we see it now, is that they actually say there's no end to these wars. The war on terror will go on and on and on and on. And so it started with a war on terror. From the very beginning, those who were called the terrorists were the Indians,
right,
who were preventing settlement. So the counterinsurgency that developed very early, it developed actually in the British colonies by the settlers. And then you had Washington and his militia and all these people, their militias. Well, why did they have militias? Who were they fighting? They were fighting the Indians, directly, without the redcoats or anything else. They were making, expanding on their own within those colonies that had been established and recognized by Britain as colonies, but they weren't really settled because Native people were there, farmers. So our present military is built on these wars, and that's something that is rarely considered except by people who think it's a great thing. That's the case, that the Indian Wars were valiant and are the basis of the U.S. military, and those are mostly very militaristic right-wingers.
So if I could restate, or just to boil it down, what we can see from this actual history, as opposed to the sort of the myth, is that the war against essentially the natives was building a structure that we are still in, a legacy that we are still in many ways confined by, or dictated to by, or is a sort of a structure by which we still live, as opposed to it being an anomalous sort of brief period where we committed genocide, and then once we got that out of the way, we started afresh on some level.
Right. That it's tragic. Most people now will, say, well, at least liberal historians and progressives, this is tragic. They go into depth how horrible it was, but it happened, and that's it. And not look at, well, what are, not only that they're still Native peoples, and they're still living under a colonial system in the United States, but also that it is the very basis of the structure and the behavior of the United States and the world, and domestically. And if you combine that, it's necessary to combine that with the other side of that core, which is slavery, plantation slavery, and private property, because it wasn't just labor that slavery was about. It certainly was about free labor, unpaid labor, forced labor, but it was also about bodies as commodities. So you have land, native land as commodity, native bodies as commodity. Those two things are what built the initial accumulation of capital and the independent United States. And, of course, the Cotton Kingdom, that's now being recognized as the very basis of the formation of U.S. capitalism,
right.
Not industrial revolution.
Well, I want to go. Well, I guess start at the beginning, because your first chapter, "Follow the Corn," really gives a sense, I think broadly speaking, if I had to guess, this audience in a broad sense has an awareness, and certainly a sense that there was a deep injustice committed, and perhaps a rolling one. But what I think most people don't fully understand was, which is central to that myth, was that when the Puritans essentially showed up in the United States, there was in fact a civilization, and there were nations, and there were you follow the corn, it gives us a sense that there was sort of an infrastructure. Will you talk about what existed in terms of roads, in terms of trade, when prior to the arrival of the colonialists?
Yeah, that's also part of the origin myth, going back to the Pilgrims, and the Puritans then don't like to talk about Jamestown because that was so obviously a brutal mercenary colonialism. but there was an ideology attached to the Puritans, which is they were going into the wilderness to build a land of milk and honey, and all these biblical the Zion. They used all the Zionist language for their errand, as Perry Smith, the historian, called it, errand in the wilderness. They considered it. And it was a responsibility they were carrying out in their minds. They rationalized it as a responsibility to do this, not just a privilege, let's say, or they just wanted to make money or whatever, own land. So they built this whole ideology around it, and in order to do that, they had to dismiss the civilization that they were colonizing as really human. They're subhuman, just like those who raided for slaves in Africa did not recognize that these are great civilizations. These were, many of them, Muslims, practicing Muslims with mosques and huge cities, and they were, they had to, and with all of colonialism in India, everywhere else, they have to make subhumans out of the victims of colonization in order to rationalize it, and white supremacy is so tied up in that it's, inseparable from it, Euro supremacy. And that still reigns in this country, of course, as we know. So what existed, what got built even in those colonies and throughout the continent could not have happened without an infrastructure already existing. There simply wasn't enough mechanisms, enough power, enough of anything to be able to go in. We know that about India. They didn't go in to a wilderness. They couldn't even think of that in the 19th century. That wasn't very likely to go over. They simply appropriated. But settler colonialism has to justify not just linking up and dominating economically the colonized, but also eliminating the native in order to take the land. So it's a special kind of colonialism that we see that is a minority of colonialism. It's the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, to some extent Argentina and Chile, as the Spanish started imitating the Anglos with settler colonialism. But the roads existed, the road networks, trade, vibrant trade, the civilization that is always recognized as having existed in central Mexico is portrayed as this vicious empire, but it was a huge civilization, still developing. That central government in Mexico was about to be overthrown by many other peoples when the Spanish intervened. But out of the Valley of Mexico came this unique grain of corn, this nutritious item that existed nowhere else in the world, and it spread from the south of South America to the subarctic, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And with its spread, it didn't just blow in the wind. It has to be planted by human hands. It was carried through trade routes. So that developed over a period of 10,000 years. And by the time the Europeans came, it was flourishing. And it's considered three of the seven seats of civilization are in the Americas. There's the Tigris Euphrates, there's the two in China, and then there's the three in the Americas, in the Andes, in central Mexico, and the whole eastern part of North America was an incredible agricultural paradise, civilizations. towns. At one time they had huge cities, but they devolved into towns, into federated towns, systems that we should really look at now as models of how people can live in the future in peace, and with good social relations, communal land, indigenous socialism.
So I just want to be clear, so that people understand. So it wasn't just what we now call America, United States of America, was not just. It wasn't just tribes, nomadic tribes everywhere. There was an infrastructure which, when we look back at history at that period and talk about, we're seeing trade routes via ocean and bringing different products from the east to the west, et cetera, et cetera. The same dynamic was existing here. And when we talk about the roads, we're not talking about hunter paths, or
right.
We're talking about roads that have trade stops through them, like in the way that we imagine, the inn, I guess, on the road.
And even towns, dotted along the road.
How were the roads? How were the roads organized? In other words, I know there was a road from Mexico to what is now Canada.
It's all the way to the Bering Straits, actually, all the way to northern Alaska, to western Mexico on the Pacific. What the Pan American Highway is built over that road. Almost all of our interstate highways are built over, almost all the highways in the whole hemisphere are built exactly where those roads were. So these were appropriated. They were already mapped out. They were already... That's why it wasn't hard for these surveyors like George Washington and later Abraham Lincoln and all going out to, in their pre-colonial projects of mapping the land. It wasn't hard to map because it was already, it was already so organized. How
were these roads, how were they built? I mean, not literally how were they built, but how was it organized in terms of, who would take responsibility for a road that goes that far?
Well, this is one of the unstudied, since very few historians even recognize these civilizations. They leave it to archaeologists to reconstruct, and archaeologists are very politically inclined as well in the United States to have a certain interpretation of migrations and development. So what they find, they interpret in a certain way. And, it's called science, but it's pretty imaginative. It's not exactly like astronomy, or physics. So it's a lot of guesswork and then creating a narrative, and that narrative is always an imperialistic one rather than one that recognizes. What we really need to have a lot of research on, and I've done some of it in a particular area, is how labor was organized, how work was organized. And where I've studied it at in the Pueblo of New Mexico, there's still 21 of these city-states in New Mexico that preceded the Spanish conquest. They've been there 10,000 years. And they are farming, agricultural lands. They had lived in larger city-states in the West, in Mesa Verde, but they devolved in this period of devolution that, some interpret as these rise and fall of civilizations. But, that's a European concept. To me, what I saw them doing is devolving, as they saw that they were exploiting the resources, particularly the wood, and that caused erosions from their irrigation works, their huge irrigation works. So they devolved, and they then lived along rivers where they had the main, the irrigation could be off the river rather than, these massive irrigation works that existed in Mesa Verde. prior to the Europeans coming. So they moved into these riverine areas, and that was a lot, centuries and centuries ago. But what I studied there in this book I did on the history of land tenure in New Mexico, called Roots of Resistance, is I looked at the ceremonial, what's usually been written about as ceremonies, and these ceremonies almost always were around food, and of course corn is the sacred food, and they were organized in such a way as for equitable distribution through ceremonies, and they had a system of, and they still do, ditch moss, it's called in English, as a irrigation, and this is, in the concept of Oriental despotism that Marx unfortunately picked up, is to build the pyramids and to build these huge civilizations. You had to have slave labor. That may have been true of Egypt, but that was not true in the Americas. That there was, with these irrigation works I found, and the building of the cities themselves, which were large, and made of stone, and stone had to be collected. And these are people who did not, who did not use animals as beasts of burden, who did all their own carrying and labor. They had serial bosses. The ditch boss for irrigation was a 1-year term. And that authority was absolute in terms of the water distribution to keep it equitable, so war would not break out between the different users of, because this is, a desert with water. Interestingly enough, all of these areas of the world where civilization first appeared were semi-arid or desert areas. So I've always found that interesting as well, that
right. It's a little counterintuitive, right? You would imagine they would grow up around water more.
Right. And Northern Europe was very late in, in being able to feed its people. It really wasn't able to do that until about with colonialism in the 19th century, importing things. But they ruined all their agricultural lands with enclosure and turning to grazing and rural monoculture like that. But the native peoples always kept the varied items. Even the corn had about 90 different varieties and colors, as the potatoes did, as the squash did. All the gourds we see now, there are about 100 different shapes that still exist. There are probably many more then, each with a different nutritional value. And they have to be planted together, and with the beans as well, in order to create the nutrition in the soil. So once that's changed to monoculture, whether it's food crops or textiles, it destroys the land. So they were very good stewards of the land, but they did reform it, remake it. They made it livable for humans, but still respectful of the environment and particularly of animals.
But ultimately, the point is that you have there's clear evidence and indication of a complex system of organizing a society, and of a what appears also to be a concerted effort to make that society sustainable. I mean, that is why people sort of create these civilizations, all of which run contrary to the initial myth that allowed for the idea that we're conquering, from the colonialist perspective, we're conquering nature, as opposed to we're actually conquering people.
Right.
And
systems, right.
And so,
and they picked up, they appropriated the land, but they also appropriated so many practices. The canoe, the birch bark canoe, the log house, all these things that are seen as these great inventions of the pioneers of the United States were all already there. They just
Right.
imitated them, or in many cases simply drove the native people out of their towns and took over and lived there in their houses.
It's funny that you say that, because I was just listening to another podcast that was talking about the sort of the American myth of the rugged individualist and Daniel Boone and those type of folks. And one thing you associate with those great pioneers is not that they were just borrowing technology that was already existed, that they were adopting technology, which runs, of course, counter to this narrative of them being great individualists. Yeah, it's very easy to be an individualist if you have already been presented with the technology and the infrastructure that allows you to go out into the so-called wilderness. But I also want to touch on a couple of other aspects. I want to jump to Andrew Jackson for a moment, and because on some level that strikes me as the next. The next sort of, major sort of myth building where you have the last of Mohicans and this idea that we were dying out anyways, and you guys we finally hand you the baton.
Right.
Will you talk about that? Because that seems to be the next sort of like phase, right? We come in and say we're just conquering the wilderness, and then coincidentally, a lot of these folks, or not quite humans who are here, die off, and then they look to us to maintain their legacy of some sort.
Yeah, they. I think up until that mythology that began developing in the 1820s, a generation after the revolution, or more than a generation after the founders, had kind of faded away, and there were new ones there. They began constructing a mythology that justified the taking by this gift giving, the gift giving Indian, that the native people welcomed these colonists. I don't believe that for a minute, not at Plymouth Rock or Massachusetts Bay, that these native people welcomed these people moving in. I think that's a total myth. They just, they didn't come with an approach that would have received a welcome. Let's put it that way. So apparently they did welcome other visitors earlier in time: Irish, Vikings, people who were not there to conquer, probably Japanese, Chinese, Pacific Islanders, maybe people from Africa and India who traveled to the Americas or back and forth. There did not seem to be this problem, but they created this. It's an interesting myth because it's deep in our mentality because of the stories that are read as children. They're still read, Last of the Mohicans and the Leather Stocking Tales, but then we have the Little House on the Prairie, to kind of update it, and we have the new movie of Last of the Mohicans, a blockbuster, and this is literally an adopted white guy who is handed by his adopted father, the Mohegan, the last Mohegan, say, yes, we're fading away. We can't survive. It's now in your hands. We give it to you and will it to you, and you take care of it. Well, that's a very handy myth, and right. I think.
And it's the passiveness involved in we can't survive, as opposed to we've been killed.
Right, exactly. And Jackson is, I think he's the most important figure in U.S. history, not because he was a psychopath, but I'm not sure that distinguishes him that much, from many of those leaders. But his trajectory from he was a child, he was the spawn of Thomas Jefferson, the great architect, as he's called, of the whole colonial system, and how to get rid of the native people, to appropriate the land and how to expand. And Jackson started out very young, as head of the Tennessee militia. And these militias, as I said, they had two roles. Certainly by that time, two major roles. One was because the native people of the Southeast had not been displaced and conquered at all, and the plantation economy had become quite robust by that time, and so they were to police the militias were to police the slaves, to keep the slaves intact, but also to drive the native people out, to go into their villages fully armed on horseback and simply burn everything down, burn all their crops, burn their storage, and drive them out walking as refugees, so that they would have to find someplace else, some other town to settle in. Eventually, of course, or very quickly, many of them went to the refuge of the Everglades, where the Seminole insurgency carried on from 1810 to 1850. Three major wars that Jackson led, or the first two he led. Well, the first one he led, and the second one he was president, and the third one was in 1850. But Jackson was first Tennessee militia. He took his militias into Georgia to attack the Muskogee Creeks, to drive them out. So it's created a huge number of refugees, starving, lots of disease that happens, when people are in crowded conditions. And some of them, the younger men, would go and join the insurgency, but the refugees were left astray. And because of his success in doing that, all on his own, without any, even though the Constitution already said that only the federal government could have relations with Native nations, here he was, the head of a Tennessee militia, carrying out these wars against the Native people. And not only was he not punished, he was rewarded with a commission as Major General in the U.S. Army, and then was tasked with, fighting the Seminoles and of course the Creek Muskogees in Alabama. They're trying to clear this area for plantation agriculture to expand, which made the Cotton Kingdom. So that was happening right after the Revolution. There was this total war that continued. In fact, Native people were the main people they were fighting in the War for Independence. The British could not have fought as long as they did with just regular troops. When the independence forces the separatists were using counterinsurgency methods, the British had standing troops that didn't do counterinsurgency. So they were mainly, the Native people were fighting like crazy to prevent independence, because it's not that they loved the British so much at all, but it was very clear that their immediate and direct enemy were these avaricious, land-hungry, greedy, slave-owning settlers,
right.
And that the British was the only, that they were far away and could be handled through diplomatic means. and they had restricted the Indians had won, and the French and Indian War had won that demarcation that the settlers could not go over the mountain range. So Jackson then, became president on this populist wave of taking land. And so he's not an anomaly, he's not just, the bad guy, that should be condemned. He is the key to the development of the United States really being formed from its beginning as a kind of capitalist corporate body. I don't think it can even really be called a republic in any, political sense that we know. It was really formed as a corporate body to build wealth.
And when you can do that via genocide, you get put on the $20 bill. That's the thing that amazes me. Is I think that most people don't realize when they look down at that $20 bill that this guy is there basically because he was able to slaughter so many natives that it sort of propelled him and the country forward. I want to, I could talk to you for hours about this, and I want to really encourage people. We have a link at majority.fm to the Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. But just I want to wrap up by asking you, what are we going forward with this? What are some of the biggest, if not the greatest benefit to understanding this history and to the idea of not living with these sort of these myths and just, I guess, is the biggest takeaway that we can learn lessons from the struggle, the ongoing struggle of natives? Is it that we can understand our present and our future more by really having a clear, less or more demystified vision of our history? Or is it also, some measure of practical lessons for sustainability on some level? I mean, what's the? I hate to make you sort of split the baby in that way, but what is in your mind the most important aspect of those?
Well, the most important aspect is freedom, I think, for people to free their minds of toxic thinking that makes people into crazy without really having any kind of chemical problem in the brain. As far as I can tell by the science, that there's something going on with the violence in this country that is beyond, way beyond chemical imbalance. And if people learn this, how would they be looking at this police violence that we're dealing with right now, fortunately, and this uprising that's so important? It's where did this violence come from? It's so ingrained, because the police are basically those militias made official, put a badge on them and pay them a salary. They did it for free back then, or just for the loot that they could get. And they know that's what they are. They still use the bagpipes. These are mostly Scots-Irish people in these militias. They still use bagpipes for their funerals, police do. It's not because they're all Irish either. So it's, the traditions are so strong, and there's such a gap between the intellectual class in the United States and the settler class and their reproduction. So they're not just like, let's say, the apartheid in South Africa, this small group of people who did take over, but they certainly never convinced the majority of the population of their point of view. They had to use extremely oppressive methods to keep people down. Well, the United States has to do that more and more. But it's not, it's all the immigrants who are brought in. They are subsumed with this, their citizenship tests, everything. They have to learn, they have to adopt this, this point of view of who they are, and then they have to fight in those wars, and they have to then teach that if they're going to get a job as a teacher, or if they're going to get a job as a journalist. So it's, you know, it's a toxin that just fills everyone. It's just not just a small group of, you know, say the Tea Party, although those people really do represent the, you know, half my family is from this this class of settlers, the Scots-Irish, poor, mostly poor working class of my father's side, and going across the frontier. So I know us well. I know them well, you know, and I understand their point of view. And that doesn't make me sympathetic with it. It makes me say it has to be dismantled, even in the young people of that group of people. But it has to be really challenged. And liberals are always just challenging in ways that don't even come near what the problem is, like the whole gun debate about putting restrictions on guns. Yes, they can do that in Canada and Britain and New Zealand, and it works, or in, you know, in other parts of the world. Or they don't have gun laws in Switzerland, and people don't kill each other. They don't go around with guns. There are no gun laws at all in Switzerland. There are never any homicides. So it's not just because it's a small country. You know, we have to really almost anything you pick up and look at. You know, unless we find our movements just expiring because they get to the end of their rope. You know, the anti-Vietnam War, everything that was coming out there. Even some of it having to do, this is when I started picking up on this counterinsurgency in Vietnam being like the Indian Wars. You know, I was only a graduate student in history then, but the language of it, you know,
right,
calling it Indian country.
and we see that with our weapons systems as well. Well, sadly, we're out of time. But again, the book is, we will link to it at the site, our site, An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, thanks so much for joining us today.